Over the next few weeks, we'll have some fun exploring the new spline modeling tools in 3ds Max. Over the course of several updates to versions 2018 and 2019, we've seen some very cool spline modeling tools added. This week, we'll start with the Freehand Spline, which allows us to draw splines interactively in the viewport with the cursor. And in subsequent movies, we'll look at other spline tools such as Optimize, Normalize, and Overlap. So let's start with the Freehand Spline to draw some vines on this temple column here. You'll find the Freehand Spline tool in the Create panel, in the subpanel for Shapes, and in the pull-down list, the default Splines. At the bottom is the Freehand tool. Click that button, and if you just draw on the grid, you will see a line appear. And as soon as you release the mouse, the object has been created. And if you draw another stroke, you'll create another object. I'll right-click to exit out of that. So you can see that we can select either one of these. They're two separate objects. Okay, I'll delete those. Let's go a little bit deeper into the Freehand Spline creation. Click on Freehand again. So that we can see more, let's turn on Show Knots. A knot is another word for control vertex. So it's not called a vertex anymore, it's called a knot. And if we draw with Show Knots turned on, we can see that we've got individual points on that spline. I'll right-click and delete that one. Go back into the tool and go a little bit deeper into these settings. The parameters here in the Freehand Spline rollout are important. The ones in the section labeled Create are only available at creation time, and these options here can be changed later from the Modify panel. And most importantly are the Granularity and Threshold parameters. These control the smoothness of the line. You can use them to control the number of knots on the freehand line and find a balance between smoothness and fidelity to your original stroke. Granularity controls the time-based accuracy of the spline. The speed of your cursor movement affects how many knots get created. So let's take a look at that so that we can save a little bit of time. I'm going to turn off the option to End Create on button up. What that means is when that's on, you'll get a new object every time you release the mouse. But if it's off, every time you draw a stroke, you're adding it to the existing object. Let's look at how speed affects the stroke. So if I draw a slow stroke with default settings, I get lots of points. If I draw a fast stroke, I'll get fewer points. So back to granularity, how does that work? Well, what it does is it determines how many samples of the cursor position are interpolated to produce the 3D position of a spline vertex or knot. So it's sampling your movements and then it's averaging or interpolating that information to create the absolute vertex position here. And this is the number of samples per vertex. Lower values will produce more vertices or knots, and the curve will be more accurate with respect to your cursor movements. Higher granularity values produce fewer vertices for smoother splines that are less faithful to your cursor movements. So I'm going to exit out of creation mode by right-clicking a couple of times, delete that spline object, go back into freehand mode to take a look at granularity. Let's see, with a default granularity of 3, if I draw a stroke at medium speed, this is what I get. I can't change these values, so I have to actually exit out of freehand by right-clicking a couple of times. Go back in again, and let's try it with a low granularity of only 1. And once again, draw a medium speed to my stroke. And you can see that I get more points now for the same speed of the stroke. So that's how granularity works. I'll right-click again a couple of times and delete these two. Go back into that freehand tool. Then we come to threshold. Threshold controls the spatial accuracy of the spline. It sets a threshold for the minimum distance the cursor must move in order to create a new knot. And threshold has a range from 1 to 100, Those are arbitrary values that have no relationship to scene units. Higher threshold values result in wider spacing between vertices if the speed of the stroke remains constant. Let's see what that looks like. With a default threshold of 10, I'll draw a medium speed stroke. Right-click twice, go back into the Freehand tool, and we'll set the threshold to its maximum of 100. And once again, draw a stroke at medium speed, and we get far fewer points on that curve. Okay, so I'll right-click again a couple of times, delete these two curves, go back into the Freehand tool, and I'm going to set the threshold to its minimum value of 1 also. For greatest control over the final shape of the curve, we can set the granularity and threshold to their minimum values of 1, creating the maximum possible number of knots per stroke. And then we can optimize and normalize the splines later, giving us the ability to fully control the level of detail after the line is created. And now the really fun part of this is that we can draw directly on surfaces. All we have to do is enable this constraint switch and then choose the objects that we want to draw on. Click on the Pick Object button and then click on Objects in the Scene. I'll click on the terrain, and it's listed here. I'll click on these steps one at a time. Now I've got 3 steps, and also this first column here. I've got those 5 objects listed in the constraint area. I'll click the Pick Object button again to turn it off, and then just start drawing. I recommend that you draw with surfaces oriented towards you in screen space. In other words, we want to try as best we can to draw directly on a surface that's pointing right at us. And that way we'll get best results and the splines won't do crazy things. So we'll draw this and navigate around and draw another. And we can see that there are some lines sticking out. For splines that were created with a constraint enabled, normals are computed for the knots, and that gives them an orientation. And using that orientation, we can change the offset distance even after the spline is drawn. So I'll just go around and draw a few more of these. Again, trying to make sure that I'm drawing on something that's directly pointing at me, and that way the shape will be most predictable. You can't undo here. You can try the undo hotkey, but it will not take you back to your previous stroke, unfortunately. So if you draw a bad stroke, you'll just have to delete it later. If you're done drawing, you can just right-click a couple of times and you're exited out of there. With the spline object still selected, we can go to the Modify panel. We can turn off the display of normals if we want. Turn off the display of knots too. We can change the offset value here, and it uses that computed normal information. Let's give it an offset of 0.2. And finally, the Freehand Spline primitive has rendering and interpolation settings just like an editable spline. We can go into the rendering rollout and turn on Enable in Renderer and Enable in Viewport. And in my scene, I've got a radial thickness of 1 centimeter, so that's a pretty good value here. And that's how to draw splines interactively using the Freehand tool.